Welcome back. The Biden administration will propose a budget of $753 billion for national security when it sends its official budget request to Congress later this month. $715 billion for the Defense Department, and that is restarting discussion of where money comes from for defense and where power comes from. Miranda Priebe is director of the Center for Analysis of U.S. Grand Strategy at RAND. She's writing about the source of U.S. military power and defense news with her colleagues Brian Rooney and Grant Johnson. Miranda, welcome. Thanks for coming on the program. You and your colleagues write in this piece, U.S. budget choices should look beyond immediate defense spending to investments that prepare the country for a sustained challenge. That sustained challenge, obviously, is coming from China and Russia in great power competition. What are you talking about regarding the investments that are necessary for that kind of long-term challenge?
Well, we're thinking about a lot of things, including national security spending on different departments and agencies. For example, the State Department are important parts of U.S. national security spending. But in this particular op-ed, we were focusing on the ways in which less obvious forms of government spending can actually promote national security. So we focus in particular on how infrastructure spending can promote economic growth. And we argue that economic growth has important security implications because it makes the U.S. economy larger in the long term. And this is the basis from which we can make future defense spending.
You point out a number of interesting arguments about infrastructure spending. One of them, infrastructure spending improves the resilience of U.S. military installations. That seems to be a direct cause and effect that makes an argument for that kind of infrastructure spending. What makes the most sense in the context of military installations, Miranda?
Well, we highlight just as an example, the electrical grid, which often military installations rely on the civilian infrastructure for electricity. So that's just one example of the ways in which the spending that we have on civilian infrastructure can actually help ensure that military installations are resilient and reliable. We also want to think about transportation infrastructure when it comes to military deployments. So from the military installations over to the ports or wherever they end up leaving from. And so again, the extent to which we invest in the resilience and reliability of those systems, we're actually contributing both to military readiness, but also preventing disruptions that could be problematic in the event of a conflict.
The infrastructure investments that you're talking about there, should they be primarily focused, in your view, in civilian areas? So, for example, the Army has done a lot of work over the years in building solar power at their installations and forming public-private partnerships so that they can rely less on the civilian grid. It sounds like you're saying the civilian and military integration is important infrastructure-wise, too.
Yeah, our research didn't cover the right breakdown between investments that the military makes itself in infrastructure to be more autonomous and the amount that should be spent on civilian infrastructure. I think that's a good area for discussion and debate. But we know that today that this is a challenge and that it's something where if we put investments into civilian infrastructure for domestic reasons, that it actually has spillover effects for security.
You also write, infrastructure investments promote economic growth, which enables future defense spending. That's the biggest piece, I think, that the Defense Department is worried about, is where's the money going to come from to do what we need to do in the out years, correct?
Right. Yeah, I think we want to think both about the size of the economy for what we can spend on defense in the future. We want to have choices. We want to be able to spend more in the future if threats turn out to be larger than they are now. But we also want to be able to make choices between trade-offs between security and domestic priorities. And the more the economy grows and the more we put investments in things like infrastructure that boost economic growth, the more we have those choices in the future.
I want to go back to the words that you used earlier in the piece and that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this conversation, and those are the words sustained challenge. It strikes me that's maybe what we as a government are starting to understand, and maybe the citizenry has not yet started to understand. This is almost a Cold War worldview, I guess, that we should think about, isn't it? That this is something that we'll be involved in for the next 40, 50, 70, maybe 100 years. This isn't a trend that happens 5 years out, China and Russia don't bother us anymore, right?
Right. And that was really our main motivation in writing this piece, is to say, you know, we're having a debate about today and maybe the next few years, but actually, you know, the rise of China is a long-term trend. You know, there could be bumps along the way, but at least from what we can see, this is something that we're going to have to manage and respond to for many decades to come. And so, you know, today, China, you know, the United States remains the most dominant military power in the world. China is getting stronger, but it might be even stronger in the future. And so there's questions about the trade-offs you want to make between today. You know, do we want to spend a little less on defense today to make investments that pay off in the longer term? You know, I think our policy choices will affect the intensity of the competition, and hopefully we won't have to spend more in the future. You know, we can potentially find ways to work better with China going forward. So I don't want to say that a Cold War style competition is inevitable, but I do think we want to have choices for an uncertain future. And so making investments that promote growth and are sustainable give us more options for what might happen in the future.
Miranda Priebe, thank you very much for joining me. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.